And hello, Hearts of Oak. Thank you so much for joining us on the first interview of the year. We're doing this just a day or two. And it is wonderful to have Mike Fairclough back with us once again. Mike, it's been a while. Thank you so much for giving us your time today.
You're welcome, and thank you for inviting me. How are you?
All good, all good. Recovering after Christmas and lots to look forward to. And it has been ages since we have had you on, and you've become probably internationally famous. For your educational background, 25 years experience in the field, and of course the only headmaster who stood up against the COVID tyranny which school faced, and focused on the best for children as opposed to what our government teams of experts wanted. And you suffered because of that, but also publicity wise, I think you became initially a lone voice of reason in terms of that. And you've written many books, the latest, The Hero's Voice, Finding the Courage to Speak Out, Wild Thing, Embracing Childhood Traits in Adulthood for a Happier, More Carefree Life, Rewilding Childhood, Raising Resilient Children Who Are Adventurous, Imaginative and Free. So I think the audience gets an idea of that, letting children learn how is best for them outside maybe the constraints that we sometimes find in the educational system. Of course, that is your Twitter handle, one Mike Fairclough, or your X handle. People can follow you there, links to your Substack and everything there, including all the links to the books, will be in the description. But Mike, as we start the year, I wanted to start on issue of education, and it's not something we've covered a lot. We've often covered the cultural issues in the cultural wars on information, the different tyranny that we face. But I really did want to start off on education, and maybe before we pick up on some of those strands, maybe just a 40,000 foot view of kind of how you see the education system in the UK generally, and then we'll pick on a few of those. But are you feeling positive when you look at what the current educational system is in the UK, or is it more negative attitude?
It's more of a negative attitude, and that changed over the pandemic. So just to take it back a bit, there was a point before the pandemic, sort of around 2017, 2018, when things were looking much more optimistic and positive with regards to education. And by education, I mean equipping children with the skills and knowledge that they actually need in life, and particularly the application of character education. So instilling qualities in children such as resilience, moving beyond the comfort zone, being aspirational, all of these sorts of things. And as a head teacher, I was actually a head teacher for 19 years, and it was of a school which I was able to put on the map because of our innovation. So it was a state-funded school for 7 to 11-year-olds, 365 children, 60 members of staff. And I took over the management of an area of 120 acres of marshland opposite my school site. And on that, taught the children about local history. So the site of the school was on a local Bronze Age settlement. So 3,000 years ago, some of the kids' ancestors may have been living and hunting and all sorts of things on these raised wooden platforms on the marshland. I then started raising different animals, so sheep and goats and chickens, and eventually a herd of water buffalo as well, unusually. And then we started to teach the kids to shoot 410 shotguns and air rifles. And you would expect the authorities to be kind of up in arms, excuse the pun, about that. But it was the opposite. Apart from one initial Daily Mail article, which said that I was kind of like this redneck hunting, shooting, fishing person, which is kind of true, but that I was sort of like indiscriminately giving kids sort of Uzis and M16s and stuff, and just saying, go ahead, kids, just shoot them up. It wasn't like that. It was very, very well managed, and we were working with the British Association of Shooting and Conservation to teach the children about the responsible use of a firearm. And simultaneously, I taught the children to light a fire, cook over an open fire, all of that kind of stuff. And what happened was, apart from that one Daily Mail article, which then turned, it had the opposite effects. The public came out in full support of me, and the same thing happened on a UK television program called GMTV, Good Morning TV, and it was Susanna Reid who invited me on and said, bring your guns and your knives and everything, and we love what you're doing, it's great. And then I rocked up, and she started to kind of attack me for teaching the kids these things. And it was really interesting because, again, the general public, not just nationally but internationally, came out in full support, and they were saying that's not what it's about. It's about teaching children about responsible use of a firearm, so they're not glamorizing it through films and on video games and stuff. At the time we held Olympic gold medals in shooting. That's clay pigeon shooting and target shooting with an air rifle. And all of those Olympians had started when they were children. So I was able to put that kind of information in. And it was interesting as well, because the kids at the school, some of them were taught by the same person who taught Prince William and Prince Harry to shoot. So there was definitely this kind of snobbery around it. It was like, well, you can teach private school kids to shoot a gun, but definitely don't give it to kids from a council estate because they might kill people. So it was interesting to see the public's reaction and how many people talked about a golden age in education when they would be doing the same sort of thing, including looking after animals and going for walks in the countryside and learning the names of trees and all that kind of stuff. And so it was interesting that the public response. But what I did was to really emphasize the character education foundation upon which all of that rests. So it's not just about doing mad stuff with a gun or water buffalo or whatever. It's all about building strength within children. So they build specifically resilience by moving beyond their comfort zone. And the reason why you do that is because life, as we know, brings up all sorts of challenges. It might be the death of a loved one, the loss of a job, societal changes, whatever it might be. And we've got to make sure that our children are equipped for such things. So anyway, it was going very well. And Ofsted, which is the UK's inspectorate, came out in support of me, gave the school glowing accolades. Members of Parliament did the same. The media changed its tune completely, including The Guardian and Channel 4 News. Channel 4 News had a piece which had 17 million views on Facebook alone. And again, it was international, and people across the globe saying, this is what we should be doing with kids, making them strong, getting them to have a love of nature, all of that kind of stuff. And then I started to notice after that time, there started to be this kind of creeping shift in narrative, and it was specifically around identity politics. So there was one particular course which I was asked to attend with all of my staff. It was online, and all of the schools in my county where I live were invited to do the same thing. And there was this guy on there who was basically talking about gender ideology, which was kind of new to me at the time. And I was thinking, oh, this is interesting. And he said, look, you've got to stop using the terms boy and girl because there's a chance that a boy might be a girl and a girl might be a boy. And I remember thinking, what are you talking about? And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, there's this thing because basically boys might be girls, girls might be boys. And so you should use gender neutral terms like folks. And I said, well, I'm not doing that because that doesn't make any sense to me. And it was interesting. I started to get a little bit of kickback and friction, and then it started to seep into other areas of the discourse within the curriculum. Before long, through the personal social health education program, it started to be pushed as a narrative, and to the point where children in other schools were being invited to tell their teacher what gender they were on that particular day. And at the same time, there was other kind of weird stuff like kids saying that they were cats, and people had to like say, yes, that's a cat, and all this kind of stuff. And it felt really kind of surreal, but I kind of felt like, okay, I've got my thing going on. I've got the positive energy going on with the school. I need to be mindful of this and be protective of my school around these sorts of issues, but, you know, see what happens. Anyway, after that, the pandemic kicked in. And it's really interesting because one of the first things that happened with the pandemic and school closures was the UK government said, look, even though children are at extremely low risk of serious illness from COVID, they should be at home. And during this time, during lockdowns, you do not have to study the curriculum at all. It's up to you what you do. So it was very interesting, this different messaging going from you've got to do this, you've got to do that, because it's very pressurized within the UK education system to hit the grades with the end of key stage tests. And when Ofsted, the UK inspectorate, come in and inspect you, have to jump through all these different hoops. And suddenly, within like a blink of an eye, none of that stuff seemed to matter. And I'll just caveat this with saying what I've said previously, with in the fact that when Boris Johnson said many of us will lose loved ones and he first announced the pandemic, I was very, very concerned about COVID. I didn't realise that it was only affecting the most vulnerable and all of that kind of stuff because we hadn't been told. So I made the decision to tell my parents to keep their children at home if they wished to, because at that time it sounded like a zombie apocalypse, not like the flu. And I'm mentioning that because it was a few weeks after that the penny dropped, just because I had to be in school every single day with 150 kids out of my 365 and 30 members of staff out of my 60, and no one was dropping down dead and nothing was happening. So that's when I started to question things. But it was also interesting because my opponents, when I said I want to close the school, and I just did it anyway, I didn't ask for permission, I just said to parents, if you want to leave, leave. The same people who criticised me for that were exactly the same people who criticised me when I later said we need to open up schools, children should be back in, and things like I opposed the vaccine rollout to children. And I realised later that the reason why it was the same group of people is because within education, most people will only do things if they're told to do it from on high. They're not making personal independent decisions. So anyway, going back to the main point, there was a shift in emphasis away from empowering children with important and necessary character traits, and instead seeing children as sort of helpless victims, as well as in parallel confusing them with things such as gender identity. Now, as the years went on, I was only there for until the end of 2023. It was the 1st of December 2023 that 2022 that I left. But it was interesting to see how the other ideologies started to be slowly put into the education sector, all coming from the Department for Education, which is the UK government's education department. So like the Department of Education in America, in the US, this is the Department for Education in the UK. And they started to bring in things like the concept of white privilege, for example. So the idea that if you are white, then you are somehow more privileged than kids and adults who are black and Asian, which again is something that I disagree with. Having worked all my life in schools within areas of social economic deprivation and mainly white areas, I've been able to see that they've not been the recipient of some sort of legacy of colonialism. That is simply not true. And I'm also married to a dark-skinned Punjabi Indian lady whose family have worked incredibly hard to not be seen as victims. They can't stand that whole kind of patronizing rhetoric. So it's things like that. Also toxic masculinity. So it was very interesting to see how I went from being seen as this guy who was celebrating all sorts of traits, including male traits in terms of like resilience. And suddenly I was being accused by my colleagues of promoting toxic masculinity. So instead of power and inner power and strength and standing up for your family seen as a good thing, it was suddenly seen as a negative thing. Now, fast forward to where we are now with a Labour government, and all of those sorts of aspects of the agenda are being pushed really, really, really hard. And I don't see anything about what they're introducing as being about empowering children. I think it's about indoctrination. I think that's indisputable. It also runs in lockstep with other countries. What's happened so far. Hopefully things will change. I believe they will with President Donald Trump coming into the White House in January. But certainly under the Biden administration, they've pushed all that. Canada has, Europe has pushed it, all of this stuff. And I think the root of it is quite multifaceted, but Agenda 2030, the UN's Agenda 2030, seems to be a very influential factor in all of this. So yes, in summary, I think that we're in a bad place with regards to education in terms of the authorities. But then if you look at what parents want, we're actually in a very good place, because in reality, parents do not want that stuff. It's a very, very small minority of people who think it's a good idea to be indoctrinating children in that way.
Yeah, and I think it is. We're going to see a huge pushback. But when you look at the current system, you talk, and a lot of your work is about challenging children, is about building that creativity, letting them think for themselves, come to their own conclusions, and guide it that way. And we have a system where children are no longer challenged. You talked about the victim mentality, and everyone's a victim. And children, I think, are coming out of the education system not understanding why they believe something, because they've never been to a debating society and had to argue their case on another issue, or their views have not been challenged and they've never had to stand up for themselves. So is it possible at the moment in our education system, and ours is no different really than anything really in the West? I think it's been a copy and paste job, but is it possible for children to come out as adults, as individuals who are ready to face the world whenever they've come from that kind of cocoon position, whenever creativity has been destroyed and they've not been challenged on any viewpoint?
Well, this is a slow burn way to destroy a society and culture. So it's not necessarily going to happen within a generation, but I think it's entirely possible that that can happen. And the reason it starts with education is because education then covers everything, because children start at elementary school, primary school, they then go to high school, they then go into the university system, they go out of the university system and they occupy positions within different sectors. And if they've been indoctrinated from the beginning, then that indoctrination rolls on. And, you know, Jordan Peterson talked about this quite some time ago in 2019 when he was warning the Western world that this was something that was coming down the line. And sure enough, that's what's happened. But I would say that all children are born with certain naturally occurring traits. So they're all naturally imaginative, for example. Children are naturally inquisitive. Children have a fascination with the unknown. Children are natural risk takers. They seem to have an innate sense of gratitude and optimism. They're naturally resilient. You know, they'll fall over, they get up and they get on with it again. Just look at any child at any age and see what they're like. If you put them in a garden they've never been to before, they'll be like, what's under here? What's under this bush? You know, going into like, let's look under this stone and discovering a world under there. And their imaginations lead the way. And it's really interesting because looking at any sort of authoritarian regime, which would include our own within the UK, the traits of imagination, risk-taking, embracing the unknown, all of these things are demonized by the state. And we saw this vividly during the COVID era. It's like, okay, so, don't, and intuition, I would say, is another massive aspect of it. Like, don't trust your intuition. Don't ask questions. Let us tell you what to do. Become fearful of everything from COVID to a hot day, to a windy day, to a rainy day. I mean, it's extraordinary. I remember the summer before I left my school, there was it was a day in June, and it was I can't remember the exact temperature, but it wasn't any hotter than previous Junes. And at the time, on the same day, the BBC were running this, and everyone else in the media running these kind of scare stories that you shouldn't go out in the sunshine because there's a distinct possibility that you could die as a result. And I was taking my year 6 children on a 2-day outside trip. One of them was to the woods where we were going to do our forest school, which is like lighting a fire, cooking over an open fire and all the rest of it. And because of the canopy of trees and the fact that it's summer, obviously there'd be shade and it would be possible to have a fire there and cook our pizzas and all the rest of it. And there were enormous efforts by certain people to try and stop me from taking the children on this trip. And they were saying, you're reckless, children are going to die and all this kind of thing. I mean, it was really extraordinary. They were just parroting what they'd heard in the media. Anyway, I went ahead and did it. And I didn't once have to tell a child to put their sun cap on or to take a drink of water when they were thirsty or anything, because all of the children knew that if they're out in the sunshine, it gets a bit hot, they just go into the shade. If they're thirsty, they're going to drink some water. I mean, it was extraordinary. But this was indicative of, at the time, of this new emergence of this kind of nanny state, like fear everything and we will let you know what to do. And I remember feeling really irritated and putting the radio on my way home after one of these excursions, and it was a Radio 4, BBC Radio 4 program, and there was a scientist in inverted commas saying, okay, when you're really hot, what you can do is you can go into the shower and have a cold shower to cool down. And I was thinking, this is a radio station for adults. This is totally infantilizing people and getting them to the point where they have to say, so how do I cool down? How do I warm up? So, but going back to my point, children are born with all of these naturally occurring traits in terms of imagination, risk-taking, embracing the unknown, etc. And they all happen to be the exact things that tyrannical states and tyrannical individuals as well, such as an abusive partner or a micromanaging boss, all of them fear those traits in people, because if you're imaginative, you can imagine your way out of a predicament. If you're willing to take risks, then you're likely to say, I'm not happy with this, I'm going to do something different. If you're naturally inquiring and you embrace the unknown, then you're going to look through the unknown and realize that that's where all the magic is. So I think that it's very, very difficult to break that within a culture instantaneously, but it's entirely possible to do it over time. And I think it's very interesting that if you look at teachers today, so 30 years ago, I qualified as a teacher, and at interview, we would be interrogated to see what our sort of intellectual status was, whether we had the intellectual capacity to actually become educators. When we were training for a year, we'd have to study Vygotsky, Piaget, the Russian thinkers, all these different sort of, including Socrates as well, and the Socratic form of thinking, so critical thinking. And we would then apply that in the classroom. And interestingly, staff rooms at that time were full of passionate debate about education, because of course there's lots of different ways that you can approach education. Now, most teachers are of the same TikTok generation as the children that they're teaching, and you're more likely to hear conversations about what they saw on television last night than anything about educational philosophy and pedagogy, etc. And I think TikTok is possibly one of the most nefarious influences within the education system as well, because particularly as there is clearly very, very obvious Chinese Communist Party influence on that platform. If you compare the TikTok that we have in Britain, which is telling kids, oh, you might be a boy if you're a girl, you might be a girl if you're a boy, and all the transgender stuff, and also how to self-harm, and almost celebrating like depression and all of that sort of stuff. In China, there's videos of kids learning how to strip down a gun. There's kids like doing 100 press-ups and then like running up a mountain and stuff. There's a curfew with the TikTok, etc. So that whole platform is about empowering the young, whereas the same platform here is about disempowering them. But I'm, as an optimist, I'm always optimistic that particularly in Britain, unlike China, which has had tyranny and communism for decades, we within Britain are the kind of people who eventually push back. And there's enough of us within the freedom/resistant movements who are willing to sacrifice our personal short-term needs in order to protect our children and to protect our culture.
Okay, and I mean, TikTok, the whole issue with the CCP and the influence there, but the wider issue about technology. I know with my kids that they actually don't have physical books any longer. That no longer exists. That everything is on a screen, on a tablet, and of course, the response to younger kids I don't know, Google it. That's literally the response. Whatever Google tells you is the truth. How does that kind of damage creativity in children, and it's our learn where it's focused on a screen, and simply not having a book and pen and highlighting stuff, to me that's actually damage in itself.
Yeah, so it's definitely prevalent throughout the whole of the education sector within the United Kingdom, and most schools have what's called an interactive whiteboard, so a massive screen instead of a chalkboard or a whiteboard at the front of the class. So they're always looking at screens. They obviously go home and they'll be looking at screens, etc. And there's lots of research into this, and it's showing that it has an impact on everything from just kind of general fitness, because it's a very sedentary way to be. It's having an impact on eyesight, but it's also having an impact on the different ways that children experience the curriculum. So it's really important to say that there are obviously schools which do still do things in books and are giving children reading books to read and who are doing experiential things, but these are not the things that are being pushed and advocated for with the same vigor and enthusiasm as this kind of screen approach. But I'm a real advocate of learning through experience. So, for example, going back to my school where I was the head teacher and the Bronze Age projects that we had on our 120 acres of land, which was also the site of the second largest Bronze Age settlement in Europe, I started to build with the children a Bronze Age replica roundhouse. So an actual physical building, about the size of this building that I'm in now, which is at my home. And the children literally built it themselves. They put the thatch on the roofs. They laid down the raised wooden causeway. Once it was completed, I engaged with local archaeologists and historians who brought artifacts which had been found on that site for the children to see. And I remember one particularly electric experience where the children were given fragments of pottery that their ancestors made 3,000 years ago on that site. And it still had the fingerprints of their ancestors in them. And to watch children put their fingers into the fingerprints of the ancestors was something, it was like being transported back in time. And of course we had the fire going, so you've got the senses, so the smell of the smoke and the wind on the because it's all, we would be out there in all weathers, the wind on their faces, etc. But then when you go back into the classroom and ask a child to write a story as if they were a person from the Bronze Age, it's absolutely electric because they've lived it, they've experienced it. So experiential hands-on education is undoubtedly the best way to inspire powerful creative writing, to extend the vocabulary, and also to foster a sense of inquiry. And I think it's this thing about critical thinking, which is another thing which is massively absent from the UK government's education agenda. So it was actually today or yesterday, the Secretary of State for Education announced that she would be pushing for education and the curriculum to be more diverse, and saying that that should be the pivotal thing that all of the education rests on. Not that it should be about empowering children, no matter what background they're from, and teaching them to ask questions and to make accelerated progress in reading, writing and maths. It was all about diversity, which sounds like, you know, that's not a bad thing in itself, to be able to be like, well, that person's that religion, that person's that religion, that one's black, white, whatever, and cool, everything's fine. That's it. That's that lesson done. But to absolutely have that running through every single aspect of the curriculum to the exclusion of everything else, I think is extremely worrying. So yeah, I think going back to the critical thinking aspect, it was interesting that on the last complaint that was made about me, so when I was speaking out about the COVID vaccines for kids, and there were 3 complaints, 3 investigations, I was cleared across the board with every single one of them. And on the last one, which was also I was reported to the UK's counter-terrorism agencies, because apparently speaking out about the COVID vaccines meant that I was a terrorist. Again, I was cleared by those guys. That was by the Counter-Disinformation Unit and also by Prevent, which is the government's terrorism guys. But that complaint, in addition to me in my own time talking about the COVID vaccines for kids, I was also complained for advocating that we should teach children critical thinking, full stop. And that was quite, the other stuff didn't surprise me, because at that time it was like, well, yeah, you know, we know what's going on, and there's this sort of underworld of different organisations, the 77th Brigade and all the rest of it, trying to take people out who are speaking out about the vaccines. But critical thinking, that's extraordinary. And that got me thinking about my early training in education as a teacher, and the fact that we had to learn about Socrates and the Socratic form of questioning. And then I ran a little bit of a kind of straw poll with some of my colleagues within the education sector to see who, and if anyone actually knew who Socrates was. And it came out as about like 10% of people had even heard of Socrates. So that, to my mind, showed how much the training of teachers had been diluted over the decades, so that you eventually get people who are just interested in popular culture and nothing else, and are therefore more susceptible to kind of cultural conditioning and psyops, etc.
How, if you look at teachers going into the profession today, if you kind of take yourself, if you were going into the system today, or you get your first school, teacher training seems to be the enemy of that creative thinking. And you mentioned about the conversations in the staff room about the education, there was passion. I mean, has teacher training knocked that passion and creativity out, or is it still possible for individuals to actually put the children first before the system, or is that not possible any longer?
I think it's the kind of teachers who are being attracted to the profession now. They seem to be more like box tickers and not necessarily the sort of mavericks of old. So it's not like the education sector hasn't been sort of buttressing up against government policy before, or saying that this is wrong or that's wrong. Because I remember back in the sort of 70s and 80s when I was at school, and particularly the early 80s when I was at secondary school, I had the most maverick teachers. And there was one gentleman who I'm still in touch with, who's called Mr. John Winter. And I only ever call him Mr. Winter because that's who he is to me. And he was my English teacher. And I went to quite a rough secondary school where, you know, the kids were like, particularly the boys, would be like scrapping in the playground, and it was a kind of, you had to be a decent teacher to be able to manage those kids. And this gentleman was so eccentric that even the most kind of the hardest, most petrifying kind of bullish type child would absolutely sort of cower in his presence, in the sense, not in a negative way, but in a sort of admiring way. And he used to introduce us to all these different texts, like Homer's Odyssey and whatever book he was reading. And I remember one time walking into the classroom, and his chair was on top of his desk, and he was reading a book on the chair with some kind of like mad hat on. And I remember we kind of walked in and we were all completely silent. And then he put his book down and said, right, let us begin. And what he managed to do was to be able to get like the most incredible writing out of us. And I think he was one of the main reasons why I went into the teaching profession, and also why I later became a writer, along with my dad's influence. But the point being is that there's always been like these mavericks within the education sector. And if you think about sort of cinematic mavericks like the guy who the late Robin Williams played in Dead Poets Society, you know, or Jack Black in School of Rock. You know, everyone loves that kind of like the maverick teacher who comes and he like teaches some really cool, like truly rebellious stuff to the kids. And what's happened now is that you've just not got that same sort of passion or inquiry, and certainly no one is anti-establishment. You know, they are not willing to say to the government or to the higher authorities, I don't really like the way that you're doing that. And it's partly because they don't have the intellectual capacity to understand it. So most teachers will, I think, be kind of receiving this information and then regurgitating it. Although I have to say that I find it increasingly difficult to find teachers or teaching assistants who I speak to quite privately who agree with things like the pushing of gender ideology within schools, but none of them have got the moral courage and integrity to stand up and say, I'm not happy with what's going on. I say none of them. There are some, and I know some who are really going there with that, but the vast majority are like, I'm going to self-censor on this issue because I might lose my job, which is true. You know, in the UK, there are loads of people who are getting cancelled within academia for, you know, challenging or asking simple questions about the climate or climate crisis or gender ideology in particular. It happened obviously with the vaccine stuff with me, or any government orthodoxy which is challenged, you are likely to get cancelled. So people prefer to self-censor out of fear of reprisals.
I want to end off on the issue of homeschooling and kind of how that fits in.
Yeah.
I think our US audience watching, that is a norm across there in the US. In the UK and Europe, it's not the norm. And there was a headline that caught me very recently, and it was basically from The Guardian, just I think 17th of December, so just a week or so ago. Measures to tighten up homeschooling in England in the wake of 10-year-old Sarah Sharif's murder at the hands of her father and stepmother are to be unveiled in a bill before Parliament on that day. And this is the awful story of a 10-year-old girl who was killed by her father. And this seems to be a case of honor-based violence, which is a cultural issue, even a religious issue. And I've sat in the all-party parliamentary group on honor-based violence quite a number of times and heard some of those harrowing stories. But this seems to be an awful situation. And now the government are wanting to roll out restrictions, and it's as if they never let a crisis go to waste. Awful situation. And instead of focusing on maybe it may be in certain communities where this happens, have an open conversation, they are now going to bring restrictions into homeschooling in the UK where it's not really a big issue. And I kind of think, well, homeschooling could be a way of education flourishing whenever there's restrictions on the state side. But what are your thoughts on the whole area of home education, homeschooling?
Right. So first of all, the government do not care about children being murdered at home. So during the pandemic, during COVID era and lockdowns and school closures, when children were at home, this included children from vulnerable backgrounds. Although the most vulnerable were invited to be in school, they didn't have to be in school unless they're on like a child protection register. However, loads of them went missing, and the number of children who were murdered at home during that time absolutely spiked and skyrocketed. Social services were not available to help. Everyone was at this kind of hands-off sort of distance regarding that whole issue, and somehow COVID seemed to be more important than safeguarding children against harm. So they're not interested in children being abused at home, which of course is a thing that does happen. Some people home educate their children so that they are able to sexually abuse them, emotionally abuse them, or it's just general neglect or whatever. However, that's a very, very, very tiny minority. The vast majority of home educators, and I'm one of them, are not in that camp whatsoever. So just to say, I've got 4 children. I've got a 27-year-old whose partner's just about to give birth to our first grandchild, which I'm really excited about. I've got a 20-year-old and 2 7-year-old twin daughters. The 27-year-old and the 20-year-old both came to my school as students. They went through the education system, and that was fine. The younger 2, the twins, who are 7 years of age, we have home educated from the beginning, and that's been inspired in part by how children were treated during the pandemic, and things like the vaccine rollout to children in their own schools for 12 to 15-year-olds. That was chilling for me, and I thought, okay, kids are not safe, including this kind of pushing of various ideologies which don't seem to have anything to do with education and seem to be kind of politically motivated. So going back to kind of my sort of original point, if you can have children within school and capture the education system ideologically, then you have this slow burn, kind of controlled demolition, if you like, of a society from the inside. So that's why they don't want children to be educated at home, because children who are being educated at home, and by the way, home education, like in my situation, doesn't really involve a lot of it actually being in the home. It involves going off to lots of different places. My kids will go off and they'll do some horse riding somewhere. They'll go somewhere else and they'll be doing some athletics and acrobatics. They go somewhere else where there's a place called Hope, Sussex, which they go to for 2 mornings a week. And one of their tutors is a Jewish lady who is one of the most outstanding teachers I've ever come across. And she's the one who's taught them about Homer's Odyssey and goes through all of the classics. She's their classics teacher. There's another lady called Katie Jo who teaches them tap dancing, which is like amazing, and drama. And she's a West End performer. And another person called Sadie who teaches them cooking. And then my wife, Punjabi Indian, is teaching them about Indian classical music. So they also learn how to play the harmonium, and we're going to get them learning how to play the sitar. And there's a whole range of stuff, but it's all sorts of things. So the palette is absolutely broad and range. And although there are definitely some very, very good things that happen within schools, there's no way that they're going to be able to match that kind of rich experience that we're being able to offer them at home. So yes, I think that this is absolutely politically motivated. It's got nothing to do with protecting children, because of course, if there was an honour killing, that could still happen if the child was going to school. There are lots of kids who are the victim of honour killings who go to school and then they're killed at the weekend, or when they go back to their the parents' country of origin, suddenly they disappear, or they do that female genital mutilation, all of that kind of stuff. So it doesn't safeguard children against harm in any way, shape or form. So what we're finding within the UK is that as Donald Trump and the whole Make America Healthy Again movement, with people who I know like Robert Kennedy and Jay Bhattacharya, who've both helped me on my journey, they're going to take the US into a new golden age, and it includes tackling ideologically driven education, which President Donald Trump has already said. Here, under Starmer, we've got journalists such as Alison Pearson being investigated for a non-hate crime that's been dropped now. We've got people like Bernie Spofforth, the successful businesswoman who was arrested for a tweet. We've got a doubling down on free speech. We've got orthodoxies being really, really pushed hard so that it becomes, for people who haven't got the guts to say anything, more and more difficult for people to challenge the system. So the kind of the agenda and the authoritarianism is being pushed hard here, just at the point that things are changing within the US. But I do feel that there's going to be a lot of these key decision makers now who are going to be jumping ship and wanting to get on the right side of history. And I've already seen this with Dominic Cummings. I don't know whether you saw that, but Dominic Cummings, who was the former chief advisor to Boris Johnson at the beginning of the COVID era, he has come out and said, well, actually, the government ministers and prime minister aren't really in control. We've got our own deep state, just like America has its own deep state. And also that there's a network, this is quoting him, a network of UK and US scientists who need to be prosecuted and should face jail time for withholding safety data related to the COVID vaccine. So I think there's at the same time as there's these efforts to become more draconian, which would include clamping down on home education, there's also a lot of people who are thinking, I don't really want to be on the side of the baddies when everything comes out, which it will do. Next year is going to be an incredible year with all of the changes in America.
It really is. And let me flap just as we finish again, your book published just March this year, The Hero's Voice, and any book that has a foreword by Dr. Peter McCulloch and Lawrence Fox, two very different individuals who we've had on numerous times, is always interesting. But what are your plans, just to finish off, your plans for this year? You obviously run those events for children to get out into the wild down there in Sussex. You've written, you speak a lot about education. What kind of do you think your focus may be in the year ahead?
So I've had to, when I was sort of ousted from the education system, trying to get back in was impossible. So that included being a head teacher or a classroom teacher. So although I've not been officially blacklisted, clearly I have been. So I had to kind of diversify. So I'm currently standing in a place that my wife and I have created called the Temple in Sussex. It was her creation, and it's basically like a yoga studio, but we also have film nights in here. We screened Plandemic, and so basically we have like film nights where my wife makes this incredible like Punjabi Indian food, and then everyone comes in and watches a film, and then there's like a sound bath and stuff. We've got various different kind of events which we run from here. So that's our kind of nuts and bolts stuff. I've also started editing books, and there's a really fantastic guy I'm working with at the moment on a book on addiction, which will be really interesting to talk to you about at a later stage. I'm also working with Molly Kingsley, who's the co-founder of Us for Them. And we've got lots of plans for the new year, including, and by the way, this is also in liaison on a separate kind of side kind of project with Dr. Asim Malhotra, but trying to really get the our version of Make America Healthy Again, but in the UK, so make the United Kingdom healthy again. So all of those really admirable, fantastic ambitions, to apply those to our culture as well. And that includes exposing more about our medicines and health products regulatory agency, so the MHRA. There's lots and lots of stuff that's coming out now as a result of Molly Kingsley and Us for Them's exposés, which we're kind of working on. And I'm also working with one of the barristers who formerly represented me, and doing a little bit of kind of sort of advice, consultation and so on for him. So this year feels like it's a pivotal year for the campaign. So raising people's awareness about everything from education to health and everything else, making the United Kingdom healthy again, liaising with our friends abroad. And I've sent a message to Robert Kennedy, as he's kind of hopefully going to be becoming the head of the HHS, and hoping that I can maybe contribute in any way that I can to that kind of whole agenda. And keeping a sense of optimism as well, because at the same time as there being these sort of very draconian authoritarian things happening, what we're also noticing in the UK is that it's waking people up in huge numbers. So even people who weren't previously red-pilled because of the COVID vaccines or whatever, they're kind of waking up because of the gender ideology stuff in schools, or because of the climate so-called crisis, and so on and so forth. So it's a brilliant time and a very optimistic time. And although there's a lot of work ahead, something I'm really looking forward to in 2025.
It's going to be a great year, and I think we're going to feel a lot of those ripples coming over, and looking how MAHA affects the UK, and we all need that re-education and a relationship change with how we see our food system and how those companies operate. So it's very exciting times.
Yeah.
Mike, I always appreciate you coming on and giving us your assessment of sort of the educational side. And as I said at the beginning, I wanted to start with that focus, which I think is essential. I think a lot of parents are questioning things as they come up their school, as they see what's being pushed through the school. They're concerned. So I know they will certainly have enjoyed listening to you. So thank you for your time today, Mike.
You're welcome. Thank you for inviting me on, and Happy New Year.